When a man confesses a 20-year secret he's kept buried, Dr. Phil stops the entire production. The cameras freeze, and what happens next leaves everyone in the studio speechless. The studio lights were blazing as they always did on a Tuesday afternoon taping of Dr. Phil. The audience had settled into their seats. Production assistants were making final checks on microphones, and the familiar energy of a show about to begin filled the Paramount Studios lot. But nobody in that room, not the crew who had worked hundreds of episodes, not the audience members who had waited months for tickets, and certainly not Dr. Phil himself, could have predicted what was about to unfold. On stage sat a man named David Mitchell, 47 years old, wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans, his hands clasped tightly together. He had flown in from Ohio at the urging of his adult daughter, who had written to the show describing her father as a good man carrying an unbearable weight. The show's producers had read that letter 3 times before deciding to book him. There was something in those words that suggested a story worth telling. Dr. Phil walked onto the stage with his characteristic confidence, greeting the audience with a wave before taking his seat across from David. The cameras rolled. The show had officially begun. For the first 12 minutes, it seemed like a standard episode. David talked about his struggles with anxiety, his difficulty sleeping, the way he would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat. Dr. Phil listened, asked questions, probed gently into David's childhood, his relationships, his career. And then Dr. Phil asked a question that seemed innocuous at the time. "David, when did these symptoms start? Can you pinpoint a specific moment or period in your life?" David's face changed. The color drained from his cheeks. His hands, which had been fidgeting in his lap, went completely still. The studio, which always carried a low hum of energy, seemed to contract into a single point of focus. Everyone watching sensed it, that shift in the atmosphere that happens when someone is about to say something that cannot be unsaid. 20 years ago, David said quietly. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of that moment, everyone heard him clearly. Dr. Phil leaned forward slightly. His years of experience had taught him to recognize that particular tone, that specific quality of voice that meant someone was standing on the edge of a confession. "What happened 20 years ago, David?" David opened his mouth to speak, closed it, then opened it again. And when the words finally came out, they were words that would stop everything. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. To understand what happened in that studio, you have to understand who David Mitchell was before that day. 20 years earlier, David had been a different person. He was 27, newly married, working as an assistant manager at a manufacturing plant in Columbus, Ohio. He and his wife Jennifer had just bought their first house in a quiet neighborhood where kids rode bikes in the street. He was driving home from work on a Thursday evening, rush hour traffic, sun low in the sky. He was thinking about dinner, about whether they should repaint the kitchen. Normal thoughts, mundane thoughts. He was on State Route 315, a highway he'd driven hundreds of times. A car merged from an entrance ramp. David adjusted his speed automatically. Then a truck swerved suddenly in the next lane. The driver had been reaching for something on the passenger seat. The truck hit the car that had just merged. The impact sent that car spinning across 3 lanes of traffic. David saw it coming toward him. He hit his brakes, swerved right, felt his own car fishtail as he fought to maintain control. He heard the screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal on metal, the cascade of collisions as multiple vehicles became involved in what the news would later call a multi-car pileup. David's car came to rest on the shoulder of the highway. His airbag had deployed. His heart was hammering in his chest. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely turn off the ignition. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, trying to process what had just happened. Then he looked in his rearview mirror and saw the wreckage behind him. 4 cars, maybe 5, all tangled together in a scene of devastation that looked like something from an action movie. Smoke rising from engines, glass scattered across the asphalt like diamonds catching the last rays of sunlight, and people moving slowly, emerging from vehicles, some walking, some crawling, all of them trying to understand how their ordinary commute home had turned into this nightmare. David got out of his car. He took 3 steps toward the scene, and then he made a decision that would define the next 20 years of his life. He got back in his car, he started the engine, and he drove away. Not because he was injured and panicking, not because he was in shock and couldn't think clearly. He drove away because in that moment, standing on the shoulder of that highway, he made a conscious choice. He looked at the scene, saw that other people were already calling 911, told himself that his presence wasn't necessary, and left. Later that night, watching the news with Jennifer, he learned that 3 people had been seriously injured in the accident. One of them, a 52-year-old woman named Patricia Carr, had died before the ambulance arrived. The truck driver who caused the accident was charged with vehicular manslaughter. The news showed aerial footage of the scene, and David felt his stomach turn as he recognized the exact spot where he had stood, the place where he had made his choice. He told himself he hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't caused the accident. He had been a victim, too, or at least an innocent party caught up in someone else's mistake. The police were looking for witnesses, the news said, anyone who had seen what happened. David told himself he hadn't seen anything useful, nothing that would help their investigation.
His testimony wouldn't bring that woman back. It wouldn't change anything. But late at night, when Jennifer was asleep and the house was quiet, David would lie awake and replay those 3 steps he had taken toward the wreckage. He would remember the moment he turned around. He would wonder what would have happened if he had kept walking, if he had stayed, if he had told the police what he saw. The anxiety started a few weeks later. Just a slight tightness in his chest at first, a flutter of panic when he got behind the wheel. Then the nightmares began. He would dream of the accident, but in his dreams, he was the one lying on the asphalt, and everyone else was driving away, leaving him there alone. He started having trouble concentrating at work. His marriage began to strain under the weight of his unexplained moods and sleepless nights. Jennifer knew something was wrong, but David couldn't tell her. How could he explain that he had witnessed something terrible and done nothing? How could he admit that he was, in his own mind, complicit in a tragedy simply by virtue of his absence? So he carried it alone, this secret that grew heavier with each passing year. He became an expert at avoidance. He changed his route to work so he would never again drive past that stretch of highway. He stopped watching local news. When someone mentioned car accidents in casual conversation, he would find an excuse to leave the room. He built his entire life around not confronting the thing he had done, or more accurately, the thing he had failed to do. 20 years passed. His daughter grew up. His marriage survived. Though it bore scars that Jennifer never fully understood, David functioned, went through the motions, maintained the appearance of normalcy. But inside, he was hollowing out, becoming less and less of himself, until the person looking back at him in the mirror was someone he barely recognized. And then his daughter, now 25 years old and perceptive in the way children become when they grow up watching a parent suffer, wrote a letter to the Dr. Phil show. She didn't know what her father was carrying. She just knew that he needed help, and she didn't know where else to turn. Which brought David to this moment, sitting across from Dr. Phil McGraw, being asked a simple question that had a devastatingly complex answer. What happened 20 years ago? David, in the studio, David looked down at his hands. When he looked back up, his eyes were filled with tears, and he began to speak. "I was in an accident," David said. "Not really in it, near it. I saw it happen. There was a woman who died." He paused, struggling to find the words. "And I left. I drove away." The studio went completely silent. Even the crew, accustomed to emotional revelations, seemed to freeze. Dr. Phil's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition that this was not a typical confession. This was something different. "You witnessed a fatal accident, and you left the scene," Dr. Phil said, not as a question, but as a statement, making sure he understood correctly. "Yes," David whispered. "I've never told anyone. Not my wife, not my daughter. Nobody knows. And it's been killing me for 20 years. Dr. Phil sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a long moment, a silence that felt like it stretched across the entire studio. You could hear someone in the audience shift in their seat. You could hear the slight hum of the stage lights. And then Dr. Phil did something he rarely does in the middle of a taping. He raised his hand to the control room. "Stop the tape," he said. The cameras didn't immediately stop. The operators looked at each other, uncertain. Dr. Phil said it again, louder this time, with unmistakable authority. "Stop the tape, now!" The red recording lights blinked off. The cameras went still. And what happened next occurred in a space that existed outside of television, outside of production schedules and commercial breaks, in a moment that was purely human. Dr. Phil stood up from his chair and walked over to David, who was now openly crying, his shoulders shaking with 2 decades of suppressed guilt and shame. But Dr. Phil didn't sit down in the empty chair next to him. Instead, he crouched down so he was at eye level with David, one hand on the armrest of David's chair, his voice low enough that only David and the people in the nearest rows could hear him clearly. "David," Dr. Phil said, "look at me." David raised his head. His face was wet with tears, his eyes red, his expression that of a man who had just unburdened himself of a weight he never thought he could set down. "What you just told me," Dr. Phil continued, "took more courage than you probably realize, and I want you to know something before we go any further. You are not a bad person. You made a choice 20 years ago that you've been punishing yourself for ever since. But that choice does not define your entire life." "But she died," David choked out, "and I left. I could have—" "You could have what?" Dr. Phil interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "You could have changed what happened? You could have brought her back?" "David, you didn't cause that accident. From what you've told me, you weren't even directly involved. You witnessed something traumatic. And in that moment, you made a choice that you've questioned every day since. But staying at that scene wouldn't have changed the outcome for that woman. It wouldn't have prevented her death." "But the police," David said. "I should have given a statement. I should have—" "Should have," Dr. Phil repeated. "Those are the 2 most destructive words in the English language. Should have, could have, would have. They keep us trapped in the past, running the same scenario over and over, trying to change something that's already happened. And David, that's exactly what you've been doing for 20 years. You've been living in a moment that's long gone, punishing yourself for a decision you can't undo." Dr. Phil reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a card. "This is the number for a trauma specialist I work with. You're going to call this number tomorrow. Not next week, tomorrow. And you're going to start the process of forgiving yourself, because that's the only way forward." David took the card with shaking hands. "I don't know if I can." "You just did the hardest part," Dr. Phil said. "You told the truth. Everything after this is about healing, not hiding." The cameras came back on. The audience who had witnessed this exchange in reverent silence began to applaud. Not the theatrical applause of entertainment, but something quieter, deeper, an acknowledgement of witnessing something real. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. 6 months later, the show received a letter from David. He had started therapy. He had told his wife and daughter everything. He had even reached out to Patricia Carr's family through a victim services program, offering them not excuses, but the truth he had carried for 20 years. They didn't forgive him, he wrote, but they thanked him for finally coming forward. And for the first time in 2 decades, David Mitchell slept through the night. Dr. Phil kept that letter in his desk drawer, because some episodes aren't just about television. Some are about the moment one person decides to stop running from their past and finally, painfully, courageously face it. And sometimes, all it takes is someone willing to stop the cameras and say, "I see you, and you're not alone."